I'm delighted to be presenting to you today, and I want to thank John and the British School at Athens for the opportunity and also the challenge to speak about the contributions from archaeology to current thinking and strategies around climate change. And I'd like to start with some contemporary points of reference that I will use as a kind of framing device for this talk. One of them, of course, is the COP26 meeting that, as John has said, is ongoing with associated activities in Rome during the main conference in Glasgow this week. And as you probably have looked up already, COP26 stands for the 26th Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, which has met annually for the last 25 years. And I'd like to draw your attention to one particular COP26 initiative called One Step Greener, which is all about individual actions, excuse me, and activism, including around growing food. And they have recently announced a series of ambassadors for this initiative. And I've pulled up for you here some of the relevant profiles. And one of my aims today is to discuss ideas that resonate with these kinds of approaches to food, and also with the notion that individual activism must accompany, for example, government agreements around greenhouse gas removal and storage. And as I hope to show, tried and tested agronomic lessons from the deep past do speak directly to some of the ideas and strategies that are being explored and, in a sense, rediscovered here. The topic of climate action as it relates to food also, of course, intersects with another well-known UN initiative, the Sustainable Development Goals that were set out in 2016. And here I want to make the obvious point that what makes these 17 goals tractable, what makes them addressable, is that they are connected to each other. Rather than being 17 separate dilemmas, they are in fact a series of interlinked challenges. So for example, goal 12, which is around responsible consumption and production of food, action for that goal then also contributes to goal 13 of climate action, but also to goals surrounding inequality, poverty, and hunger. So for example, where food production is local, where it minimizes waste, where it's climate friendly in its use of fossil fuels, and is designed with a view to sustainability rather than to maximizing profit margins, it becomes possible also to alleviate associated inequalities. And here then is another opportunity for archaeology to show how linkages between, for example, forms of agriculture, wealth inequality, and resilience to climate change have developed over the very long term. So it's an exciting time in the global discipline for thinking about the novel contributions that we can make to contemporary challenges, including around climate change. And there have, of course, been a number of events, lectures such as this one, conferences and workshops, also special issues of journals, such as this particular issue that came out in PNAS in April 2020. And a distinct argument that is made in the editorial of that particular issue is one that draws our attention also to the importance of protecting environmental archives, preserving legacy collections, and so on. And the archaeological evidence that I'll be relying on in this talk speaks to that as well. I'd also like to draw your attention with the image on the right-hand part of this slide to an online exhibit about peatlands as cultural and environmental places of importance as archives that is led by colleagues in archaeology and art history at the University of Glasgow, where the COP26 meeting is in progress. A final point of reference is perhaps inevitably the ongoing COVID pandemic. And here I'm drawing on the work of J.C. Nyala, who is a doctoral student in anthropology here in Oxford. And in her work, she is drawing attention to the allotment boom that has occurred in the UK during the pandemic, but also to the historic role of allotments in Britain in times of crisis for a combination of food security and well-being motives. And in some related work, she is also working on this initiative, the 1918 Allotment Project, which is looking at the use of allotments in the year 1918-19, the year then of the Spanish flu pandemic, and also the end of World War I, when the government pursued a successful campaign to promote allotments as a safe solution for food shortage. And so with this frame of reference in mind, what I'm going to do in this talk is to present a series of sort of earthy lessons, almost slogans, that come out of archaeological evidence for long-term food-related practice, so food production and consumption, in Western Eurasia. That will be my sort of geographical focus, so including but not limited to the Aegean. And my intention is for these lessons to take us back to what got us as a species into farming to begin with, what early farming was like. There's lots of negative portrayals and potentials and assumptions about agriculture now, but we actually have the freedom to choose how and what we farm. And the archaeological evidence, I hope, can help to liberate our thinking about what that could look like. In pursuing these, I'm going to present them as though to an audience that may at least partly be non-archaeological specialists. And I hope that the archaeologists here will forgive me for leaving out some of the jargon, the dates BC, and so on at certain junctures. And I will try and unpack what I'm going to evoke with these images a little bit later in the talk. So here's my first lesson or slogan, and it's about plant diversity. And before I fully unpack that, I'd actually like to start with the climatic context in which farming emerged in our region in Western Asia. You will probably be well aware that the Greenland ice cores, like the GISP2 core that is featured in the graph on the left-hand part of this slide, provide a vital record of past climate in the Northern Hemisphere. And this is based on annual ice layers that capture the ratios, the changing ratios of stable oxygen isotopes that provide a basis in turn for reconstructing temperature. And the broad story is that Holocene climate sustains the emergence of agriculture, not only because it's warmer, but also because it's more stable than what had gone before in the Pleistocene, in the Ice Age. So what I'm drawing your attention to is quite simply that the amplitude of the temperature curve in the upper part of the graph on the left is narrower than it is further down. Now, that of course is not the only core that is being studied from the Greenland ice. And I'd now like to draw your attention to another coring site much further north. So within the Arctic Circle, it's the Agassiz core. And its temperature reconstruction is shown in dark red in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. This is showing us reconstructed temperature change over the last 12,000 years, so capturing the Holocene, and also showing recent abrupt warming, that is the abrupt upward turn of that red graph line, heading back towards early Holocene higher temperatures. And this apparently is what Boris Johnson really convinced him that climate change was real when he was briefed as Prime Minister. So part of the whole concern around accelerated anthropogenically induced climate change is not only temperature increase, but disruption of the relative stability that we've enjoyed through the Holocene so far. Having said that, it's also important to recognize that there has always been climatic uncertainty. And that really is the underlying theme to many of the plant-related practices that I'm now going to emphasize. So sticking for the moment with the early Holocene, so going back 10,000 years ago or more, what's becoming apparent now is that the very earliest forms of plant management in Western Asia were not about selecting individual species, the progenitors of later crops, or the ancestors, but actually about managing entire diverse stands of vegetation that included both what now we would call in hindsight crops and what we might also call weeds. And I'm showing you here the sort of title and also some images from a recent study of wild cereal stands, wild cereal habitats in northern Israel, in which we've documented how wild cereal stands often combine multiple large seeded grasses, for example, wild emmer wheat, wild barley, and wild oat, as well as a range of other herbaceous taxa with potential uses. And this all helps us to understand and make sense of the diverse suites of crops that ultimately emerged with agriculture. So plant diversity was therefore embedded in the earliest forms of management from the very outset. And this is a study that was led by Dr. Alex Weide, who's a postdoc here in Oxford. Well, if we fast forward a couple thousand years from the beginning of the Holocene to the spectra of food plants that characterize early farming contexts in Western Asia, we find that they are indeed amazingly diverse. And my first stop on this inevitably strategic tour is Çatalhöyük in south central Turkey, in central Anatolia. And you can see it on the map in the upper left-hand corner in the Great Konya Basin. And currently, Çatalhöyük is one of the best documented case studies that we have in the agrobiodiversity of early farming. And Çatalhöyük was itself the culmination of a much longer regional sequence that takes us back into the 9th millennium BC. You can see the dates for Çatalhöyük here. It's more or less centered around the 6000s BC, the 7th millennium. So going to introduce you now to some of the key evidence that is the focus here. These are the remains of food crops preserved by charring or carbonization, so just through exposure to heat. And you can see here a selection of some of the diverse food plants for which we have evidence at Çatalhöyük, including cereals, including pulses, also tree, fruit and nut collected plants, wild mustard seeds, which I'll come back to in a moment, and also tubers and other plant parts. And in total, there are over 20 food plants that were routinely used and are well documented as processed and or stored resources in the archaeobotanical assemblage over this long-term occupation at Çatalhöyük. And amongst these plants are species that were recruited from the local accompanying weed flora. And one of these is the tiny seeded wild mustard that you saw in the previous slide. It's the picture of this is actually the one next to the acorns in the upper row in this kind of collage. And this was recruited because it filled a gap in the crop spectrum as a source of oil. And this is just one example amongst many of the remarkable creativity that fostered resilience over 1,500 years at Çatalhöyük and through a series of dramatic social and environmental changes. And in studying this, we've borrowed the concept of the panarchy from resilience theory in ecology. And the diagram that you see in the upper right-hand corner of this slide evokes this sense of a set of interacting units, a set of interacting cycles that are a sort of resonating whole. And we've argued that the panarchy of households at Çatalhöyük, which you can see in the architectural plan in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, acted as a kind of experimental beehive. So different households are experimenting in different ways with potential plant foods and potential staples. And this is all fundamental, ultimately, to collective resilience. They're learning from each other. So that's one key observation about how diversity operates and how it maintains resilience in an early farming community like Çatalhöyük. There's another key observation that's been made and that emerges from wider contextualization of the Çatalhöyük botanical assemblage. This is from a study led by Mike Wallace, Glynis Jones, and colleagues at the University of Sheffield. And it is that the so-called broad spectrum revolution, which was a model proposed in 1969 by Kent Flannery to envision resource diversification as a precursor to farming, that broad spectrum approach was actually perpetuated through Çatalhöyük's agroecology, that diversity continued in terms of plant use. And it's particularly then that diverse side of the economy that persisted in terms of plant-related practice that I want to emphasize here. Now, what happens longer term to that plant diversity? On one level, and certainly on a kind of bureaucratic level, and I mean that literally, crop diversity is diminished under conditions of expansive, low input agriculture and land-based wealth inequality. This is because, in a nutshell, dominant households and early states like the Hittite state, which is what these images are about, intervene in promoting the growth of a few stress-tolerant cereal crops. And they do this because those crops are more or less guaranteed some kind of return. They're highly visible in the landscape and they can be taxed. So this is the rise of monocultures. But these political strategies are complicated and in some sense outmaneuvered by the practices of small-scale producers who continue to grow a diversity of crops and to enhance the resilience of the collective system. It has often been observed in the archaeology of early literate societies in Western Asia and the Aegean that the diversity of crops we see archaeobotanically is far greater than what early bureaucratic authorities were monitoring. So there are still then multiple levels of agency in the panarchy, and even in the Hattusha silo assemblage itself, which is tons and tons of cereal grain preserved in a catastrophic burning event in this massive underground storage facility constructed in the 16th century BC as Hattusha was being established as the Hittite capital. In that assemblage, we find traces of other cereal and pulse crops, additional to the hulled barley and the hulled wheats that were being targeted and being collected in, that give us a sense of this wider agrobiodiversity. And this is currently being explored by Dr. Charlotte Diffie as part of a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship here in Oxford. And so agrobiodiversity has remained critical for long-term resilience under a range of social and ecological settings. And that observation alone, in my opinion, casts serious doubt also on any linear progressivist view of agriculture, which is, by the way, very persistent in the agronomic literature, as a series of technological problems solved and then enabling the next step in the progressive sequence. It's far more processual than that. And that perspective is what opens up the relevance of the past to the present and future. So that was point number one. Point number two is again focused on plants, and that is the good news, I hope it's good news, that we can all eat all the plants that we want to. And we can even eat them fast. I'll come back to the point about eating them quickly in a moment. Now, so far I've been focusing on plants, but early agriculture in Western Eurasia was, of course, distinctively from the outset mixed. It was based on different combinations of crop and livestock species. And this raises the question of how important in relative terms plant and animal-derived foods were to the human diet. Now, the most direct evidence that we have to answer that question is the stable carbon and nitrogen isotope values that we can extract from, for example, the bone collagen of human skeletal populations, from faunal skeletal remains, and from plant remains. And where that kind of integrated approach has been taken, which enables us to situate plants, fauna, and humans in the same food web, in the same kind of food ecology, it has become apparent that it was primarily crops, primarily plants, that fed prehistoric farming communities, ranging from early cities like Tel Brak in northeast Syria, which is the series of graphs on the left-hand part of this slide, all the way to compact late Bronze Age communities like Tumba Thessalonikis, shown on the right-hand side. And it's crucial here that we adequately sample and measure the remains of plants and animals associated with human remains. This is in part due to enrichment in the heavier isotope of nitrogen, nitrogen-15, through practices such as manuring, which can raise then the values of nitrogen isotope values of crops by as much as a trophic level. So to really understand the role of plants in the diet, they have to become part of an integrated isotopic study. Now, animal-based foods, especially in their most efficient form from dairying, were also important in the initial spread of farming across Europe, and they seem to increase in the lipid residues that we see from southern to northern latitudes. And we're here looking at a study that takes us from the western end of the Mediterranean up through northwestern Europe. And so this is direct evidence that there was a shifting balance, probably, between plant and animal-derived foods in relation to climate across Europe, and especially as some crops were lost in transit, as we know they were in the initial spread of farming. So as that crop spectrum thinned out, and as agriculture moved further and further away from its Mediterranean origins or its Mediterranean comfort zone, increasingly we see evidence of dairying. But ultimately, as population density increased and forms of urbanism emerged in Central and Northern Europe, crops were again key staples feeding early urban societies. And we've been charting, for example, the expansion of agriculture to meet those demands in this ongoing project, Feeding Anglo-Saxon England, led by my colleague Helena Hamerow here in Oxford. But how were plants being eaten? We tend to think nowadays of fast food as primarily meat-based, gyros, doner kebabs, hamburgers, etc. But prehistoric fast food was plant-based, and this is again something we need to relearn. The ERC-funded project Plant Cult, led by Sultana Valamotti at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, has uncovered amazing evidence for early plant fast food in the Bronze Age. And in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, you can see examples from the early Bronze Age site of Messimeriani Tumba in central Macedonia. And what Tanya and her colleagues have been able to reconstruct is the whole chaîne opératoire, what you see in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, of producing preparations such as bulgur, or in combination with milk, trahanas, which are different size grades of cracked plant food that have been parboiled, dried, and then ground, so that they can then be cooked quickly in liquid in a matter of minutes. Now, all of this emphasis that I've committed to plant-derived foods begs the question, what roles did animals and animal-derived foods play in these cultures that put so much emphasis on plant foods? And there are many answers to that question that would take us far beyond the minutes that we have just now. Here, what I want to focus on is what's been inferred about the role of meat consumption. And it's a million miles away from the meat-heavy diets that are prevalent in many parts of the world now, and with, as we know, urgent implications for production of methane amongst the greenhouse gases. Large-scale meat consumption was a rare event. I'm generalizing here, but I think that's a reliable inference. It was carefully commemorated in various ways, including retention of the heads and horns of cattle, as you can see in some of the examples here, and is even depicted in some early clay house models, like the examples from Promeron that you can see in the lower central part of this slide. It was often about sharing food beyond the household or even across a regional population. And meat consumption played an important social and political role, eventually in some circumstances, a socially exclusive one. And I'm thinking here of the late Bronze Age palatial feasting evidenced by Val Isakivu and colleagues at Pylos. So the prehistoric lesson here is that we need to find a new balance between plants and animals as sources of daily subsistence. Crops and livestock are complementary ecologically and nutritionally. It's good in many ways to have both. But factory production of animals, we know, is deeply problematic from both a health and a climate perspective. And it's a modern problem to which we already have an ancient solution. So that brings me to my third point. And this is actually to do with rescuing or rediscovering crops that have been lost or forgotten, as well as trying new ones. As I mentioned, crops can become lost in transit. This happened in the initial spread of agriculture across Europe. It also occurred late in prehistory in the context of the rise of cereal monocultures and land-based inequality that I alluded to before. A striking example of this was uncovered over the last couple of decades. It's a kind of wheat called Timofeeves wheat, or in the Latin Triticum timofeevi, and that identification was recently confirmed through ancient DNA analysis of archaeobotanical remains, both from Czartoryuk and from Neolithic sites in central Poland. And we know now that Timofeeves wheat emerged as a distinct crop in central Anatolia, including at Czartoryuk, where its domestication was ongoing. It was still actually in the process of losing its shattering habit, the shattering ear of the wild form. It spread to Europe in the Neolithization process, but often as mixtures with other similar wheats, emmer, and especially einkorn. And in fact, this third type of hulled wheat was not detected until Glynis Jones and Sultana Valamotti and Mike Charles defined the morphotype in a paper published in the year 2000. It currently appears that Timofeeves wheat had virtually disappeared in Europe by the end of the first millennium BC. And this was in the context of other cereals being grown as pure monocultures. And in a sense, this brings us back to the point about diversity and its erosion, its reduction through processes that I think are ultimately related to land-based wealth inequality. But the rediscovery of this wheat also opens up new scientific possibilities for interdisciplinary collaboration. The long-term archaeological record for Triticum timofeevi as a prehistoric crop has helped to bring it to the attention of crop scientists working on the genetics, the diversity, neglected crop progenitors, and also breeding for new characteristics. And this new interest from crop science is emerging in the context of long-term declines in the yields of elite crop breeds that demand huge inputs of mineral, fertilizer, and water. Later prehistory also presents some remarkable evidence for early food globalization. And this recent paper, led by Dragana Filipovic and colleagues in Kiel, has really nailed the story of when and where Chinese broomcorn millet arrived in Europe and was taken up as a short season crop, also one that follows the C4 photosynthetic pathway, which is a more drought tolerant pathway than other cereals pursue. And in that sense, it's a precursor to maize, and so complemented the existing crop repertoire. It's also gluten-free, but these millets are now neglected and long overdue for a revival. And this completes my third argument, that the long-term agricultural story shows how we need to embrace new as well as old ideas. It's not about returning to some fossilized notion of resilience. Resilience inherently means change, adaptation, and flexibility. And that brings me to my last strategy. It isn't just the deep past and the very long term that are informative, of course. We also need to talk to older generations about their memories and experience of producing food under the dramatically changing circumstances of the 20th century. Paul Halstead's book, published in 2014, Two Oxen Ahead, is, of course, a masterclass in this kind of endeavor. And I would just remind you, as I found to my delight, that you can hear Paul speaking about his book via YouTube, but hosted on the BSA's website. Now, this is a professional life's ethnographic wisdom about pre-industrial farming in Mediterranean Europe, and I hope and trust that Paul is working on volume 2, not exactly volume 2, but the follow-up to this, which is focused on the animal side of traditional Mediterranean farming practice, where Two Oxen Ahead was focused on the arable side. But Paul's work is also, I think, a provocation to pay close attention and to listen to what older generations have to tell us, whether that's these days on Skype or Zoom or over the garden or allotment fence, but now is the time. We also don't need to travel far, no further than the local allotment association perhaps, to learn from others about what they've grown, what works and what doesn't. And JC Nyala's work, for example, has made that point very powerfully during the current pandemic. Of course, various UK cities and suburbs were designed as garden cities with green spaces, and this was in a reaction to industrial pollution and the need for areas of relaxation and green space and health and so on. But we now have the opportunity to evolve this into something with a greater scope for urban food production. And that potential, in fact, for the city of Leicester, for example, was assessed in this 2020 paper by Edmondson et al., which includes emphasis also on the multicultural traditions of people from different parts of the world that can contribute to that effort. And that's what I have for you today. I hope that I've provoked some questions and given the basis for discussion. Thank you very much.